April, and you're listening to Kopi Time, a podcast on economies and markets by DBS Group Research here in Singapore. I am Taimur Baig, Chief Economist. Today, we want to dig deep on the evolving nature of the global supply chain, which has been a topic of discussion for a long time, but has taken on particular resonance in the recent years. First, as China began to push out low-end manufacturing of apparels and electronics to South and Southeast Asia's frontier economies, and then as part of the China-US trade war. Many politicians in the US feel that manufacturing is too dependent on China's supply chain, a feeling shared but perhaps less vocally by the authorities in Japan and elsewhere in North Asia, I'd suspect. Also, consider what has happened in the last few months. Take, for instance, US dairy farmers. They are, as we speak, breaking millions of eggs to prevent them from hatching, as there's been a sharp decline in demand for chicken due to restaurants closing around the country. Cheese producers are dumping milk down the drain as demand from wholesalers has plummeted. See, as it turns out, dairy farmers just can't recalibrate their supply chain to accommodate the rising demand from grocery store. It simply doesn't work because it requires very different equipment to shape and package the product. Now, there's the other end of the spectrum. Packaging companies, for instance, they're recording their best sales figures ever because delivery has spiked. Meanwhile, in China, many apparel companies have quickly retooled themselves from making clothes to producing PPEs for healthcare professionals. And these are just short-term developments. There are, of course, deeper, longer-term considerations for the supply chains. Will demand be fundamentally lower, and will the composition of that be fundamentally different going forward? Will there be more home bias? And what about the long simmering backlash against China? That brings me to today's guest, Alexander Capri, visiting senior fellow at National University of Singapore and NUS Business School. Alex, besides being an academic, is also a writer and former partner in charge of KPMG's Asia Trade and Customs Practice, based in Singapore 16 years. He is known for his expertise in global value chains, trade and geopolitics, as well as work regarding global tech, the digital economy, and the industries of the future. Alex, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Alex, we want to tap into your deep expertise on supply chains today. Let's start with the very short term. We have this COVID-19 crisis, and we have seen sudden stop in production in basically everywhere in the world. Maybe China is coming back on stream, but things are rather dicey right now. What's your sense?
Well, let's step back and just put this into perspective. So the WTO recently came out with some figures and said that year on year, if you compare this year to last year, we could see a contraction in up to 30% in trade in terms of volume this year compared to last year. So if you look at that and you put that into context, that's literally going off a cliff in terms of demand for product because of this self-induced coma that many of the world's economies are in right now, virtually all of them. As people stay home and stay locked down, so there's definitely a huge drop in demand. And that, in turn, has led to sort of a series of knock-on effects all the way through supply chains. So if there's such reduced demand, then of course airlines and cargo volumes are going to go down. Air freight is going to go down. Aircraft are going to be mothballed. That, in turn, is going to lead to very schizophrenic surges in demand as things come on, as new products come online for consumers, and everybody's grabbing for them all at once. We're seeing these huge surges in demand around, for example, toilet paper, canned food, goods, etc. So how do logistics companies try and plan for this? Well, the answer is they really can't. So if you have reduced capacity and then you have demand surging and then ebbing, it's going to be very, very expensive to move stuff when you want to move stuff. So this has been very difficult. So UPS, FedEx, DHL, they've all suspended their service guarantees, basically, in terms of being able to deliver on time and even being able to say when they might be delivered. So this has been highly disruptive, I think, from the short term. The fact that you have quarantine workers staying home and not being able to go to factories is also significant. So take China, for example. So the Chinese economy and Chinese supply chains are basically back and up and running. The Chinese economy is probably 85% back. But if you look at factories, they're only at about 60% capacity because of such low demand around the world. So this is going to continue to be a very, very tricky scenario.
Alex, what's your sense of supply chain outside of Asia? So, for example, in the US, I talk to friends, they say that supply of grocery has come to a standstill in certain stores. There are long lines, and it, of course, varies from region to region. How is even something as basic as agriculture supply chain, where we know that road commerce has not come to a standstill in the US, even that is getting affected?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, if you look at if you look at certain sectors in agriculture, I mean, look at the sale of pasta, for example. We don't really think about the supply chain of pasta when we go to the store, but in fact, pasta, the manufacturing of pasta is actually concentrated in a few places. One of which is in Italy. So you have wheat coming from around the world, going to these processing plants in Italy. And of course, we know that Italy has been hit massively by the coronavirus, and you have the lockdowns. So that has immediately impacted food availability and food supply chains. Another really tricky thing that's come out of this whole scenario is the packaging or the packing and the need to resize in order to be able to sell to individual consumers. So, for example, again, if you go back to things like toilet paper or even things like dairy products, milk, cheese, or even something as everyday as beer, alcohol. If you look at the main consumption markets for those items, those are things like hotels, schools, restaurants. But as those shut down, there's still demand for those, but it's people sitting at home, right? It's people sitting at home wanting to order from an online platform. And the size of those types of shipments are typically much smaller, much more piecemeal, which is putting companies in a real bind because they're having to figure out how to repackage these things, and they're not doing it very successfully. So the dairy industry is, in fact, wasting. There's a lot of milk and there's a lot of cheese, et cetera, that's going to waste. It's spoiling because they can't pack it and get it to the consumers in the way that it needs to be consumed.
That's fascinating. And internationally, I saw on Instagram the other day that in Holland, for example, all the tulips for the season, they're going to go to waste because they're not being able to send it to, again, I think this issue that you said, bulk versus retail, is sort of breaking down.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then you have other shortages which are due to actual restrictions. So you have export bans being placed on face masks, ventilators, pharmaceuticals in countries like India, the US, Germany, et cetera. And so that's imposing actual restrictions on supply purely from a policy perspective. So that's adding more complexity as well to supply chains.
Now, Alex, when we look at central banks around the world, nobody seems to be at all worried about inflation because they feel that the demand crunch is going to create more deflationary shocks than the inflationary problems. But when you look at these supply chain breakdowns around the world, isn't there a risk that cost of moving things around is going through the roof, or some logistics will become very expensive?
Absolutely. And again, because if you take, for example, Singapore Airlines, they've grounded 90% of their fleet, and yet we're seeing spikes in demand for more air freight to get some of these items urgently to people. And again, because of a lot of these demand surges, which I mentioned earlier. How do you price that, right? And if you look at the prices for air cargo, gone way up. If you look at the prices for shipping cargo, it's gone way up, even though a lot of the containers are sitting idle. In fact, they're stacking up in places like Shanghai, or they're you have ships going from North America to China essentially empty. And so this is just really producing a helter-skelter effect in terms of the pricing. And it's better to err on the side of having too few containers than having too many, and having too many ships on the water or too many planes in the air. So yes, the prices have gone up dramatically.
But so net, as you said earlier at the beginning of your interjection, that WTO is expecting 30% decline in volume. So we may have surging costs of moving some things here and there and some supply demand anomaly, but net, it's a pretty grim picture for 2020.
I would say yes, Taimur. And I would say one more thing on the sort of the operational side of supply chains for companies. Keep in mind that for the electronics sector, particularly for things like laptops and printers, which are in high demand now because people are working from home and they're ordering them. In fact, I just ordered a printer the other day to get more work done at home. A lot of these companies are operating off of safety stock or buffer stock that they've had in particular locations. And that safety stock and buffer stock is starting to run out. And I would say within the next couple of months, I would say the next 2 months or so into the summer, we're going to start seeing shortages in electronics, in goods that you would expect to find at the store, every day. So I think we're going to start seeing that happening as well.
Very interesting, because I worry about that right now the narrative, at least out of China, given that China is the big manufacturer of the world, is that, well, February and March are behind us, they're going back to work, and supply chain will be sort of remedied. But I sort of wonder that big gap in production, surely that cannot be taken care of just like that.
No, because if you look at electronic supply chains, they are typically set up to be fairly rationalized, meaning they're unbundled, and you have components and subcomponents being manufactured all over the place. So if you look at Southeast Asia, typical example of that, of course, is the iPhone, which gets assembled in China. But if you look at where all the parts and components come from, they come from all over the world. Well, you have similar scenarios with a lot of other electrical components and consumer electronics. So even though China is up and running, the supply chains into China for a lot of those critical parts and components are being disrupted, again, for the reasons we talked about earlier. So I would fully expect some shortages in some of these specific electronic sectors.
Alex, if you could drill down a little further, because I'm sure our listeners would want to sort of, also they would be worried to think about, are these like, high-end electronics or mid-end consumer electronics where the supply chain breakdown risks are more pronounced? Can you tell us something about what's happening to the auto sector?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to be sort of the bringer of doom and gloom. That's not the intention here. But what I do see is certainly anything to do with laptops, anything to do with sort of the accoutrements to office type machines, and a lot of other consumer electronics that that go in the home, perhaps kitchen appliances, et cetera, and maybe not so much. I think more laptops and printers mostly. Again, if you have a spread out supply chain where you have, for example, some components being made in Vietnam, other components being made in Malaysia, maybe a few more being made, elsewhere, maybe in Thailand, Japan, South Korea, et cetera. That's a lot of movement. That's a lot of movement of goods. That's a lot of back and forth and in and out of the country for components and subcomponents before they finally get fully assembled. Again, when you start looking at how these supply chains run and the amount of surplus parts and components you have, some of them are just in time, which of course are incredibly vulnerable now. Others typically operate with 60 to 90 days of what we would call buffer stock, meaning replenishment stock should there be a shortage. So So that would put us, basically into, I would say, June or July when we start seeing some of these shortages.
Alex, the global electronics narrative is hugely dominated by cell phones and tablets. So Samsung Galaxy to Apple, iPhone, iPads, etc. Is there a risk that those product productions would also get affected?
Well, that's a good question. So here we have something that I think can lead us into our discussion a bit later in the hour, and that is, what are some of the longer term effects and takeaways going to be from this COVID-19 impact on supply chains? And one, I think, is that companies are going to look to in-house more and more of their operations that they might have outsourced or rationalized previously in more of a just-in-time kind of supply chain. So when you talk about a company like Samsung, which is a fairly vertically integrated company, if you look at how they operate, I would say that a big conglomerate like that has sort of very tight, again, in-house type of operations around its supply chains, they would probably have an advantage to some of the more hyper rationalized or hyper unbundled kind of electronic companies that really have sourcing operations everywhere, and they're dealing with many different parts and components from unrelated outside parties.
You would put Apple in the hyper unbundled category?
I would. And I think one of the things that will come out of this is that Apple will probably look to move some more things in-house. We can get to that a little bit later. But I certainly think that post-COVID-19, we're going to see a move towards much more regionalized, localized, redundant, and ring-fenced supply chains, certainly for critical industries and critical supply chains. So yes, I think we're going to see some interesting new alliances, and we're going to see some interesting new sort of partnerships forming in order to bring these new sort of restructured supply chains to fruition. Part of that will be government mandated in certain cases, for very strategic goods and industries like pharma, and of course, strategic technologies. But I think some of it will be voluntary as well, because there will be new opportunities, I think, for businesses as supply chains begin to sort of reshuffle to this new landscape.
Sure. So I'll get to the longer term picture, and I'm going to definitely pick your brain on that in a moment. I just want to stick with the conjunctural for a few more minutes, if I may. On the auto sector, do you have a view? Because on one hand, there's a structural shift going on in the auto sector, or the renewable energy movement and electric cars and so on is, at least in Europe, certainly is leading to a structural decline in demand for autos that run on conventional energy. We've seen that, extreme success of Tesla in the U.S., elsewhere. And now we have the risk of, global parts shortages. Is this going to be like the final nail in the coffin for conventional cars, this crisis?
Well, it certainly means that auto manufacturers are going to be looking at much tighter sort of ecosystems, if you will. And I think it's interesting, the Japanese auto industry was hit pretty hard by the shutdown in Wuhan. So if you look at the big three Japanese automakers, they all had to not only shut down operations in Wuhan, but they actually had to shut down production lines in Japan because they were unable to get parts and components. The Japanese government is actually bankrolling an initiative for Japanese companies to essentially shift production out of China. And it's I believe it's $2.2 billion initiative that they will actually, provide funding to Japanese companies to start moving production out of China. So I think the COVID-19 event really shone a spotlight on what I would call an over-reliance of supply chains on China has done to a lot of the global value chains. And keep in mind that if you go back to SARS, which I think was back in 2003,
right?
China was about 4% of global GDP. If you go back to last year, China was about 19% of global GDP.
That's right.
And a lot of that is because of value chains and value chain clustering that has taken place in China in that period of time between now and 2003. And that has to do with a huge amount of investment on the part of multinational companies. They've really ramped it up. So that has been exposed, and that is clearly going to have to be remedied. A lot of companies have taken a look at that. So if you look at the decoupling process, or at least the shifting of certain supply chains out of China that was occurring because of the U.S.-China trade war, I absolutely think that the COVID-19 pandemic is just accelerating and has really accelerated that trend. That doesn't mean that China, we're going to see a total mass exodus out of China, but it does mean, from a supply chain perspective and from a global value chain management perspective, we're going to see more companies that have an in China for China supply chain, right, or maybe in China for China and Asia supply chain. And then they'll have a North America supply chain, and they'll have a European supply chain, et cetera. And then there will be redundancies. There will have to be redundancies, and so you'll lose some of the economies of scale that would have been sort of standard in the past 3 decades of globalization. I think those tend to go away. But clearly, in the automotive sector, that is going to happen. Now, to what extent will this lead a push to, for example, electronic vehicles, or to what extent will governments see this as an opportunity to now start steering the industry one way or the other? And in this case, I think it would be towards electronic vehicles or alternate energy sourced vehicles. And I think that is a very realistic scenario, particularly. I mean, you're the economist, Taimur, but I mean, if you look at a prolonged recession, going on for a long time, where a lot of companies need bailouts from governments, and where governments are even taking a share of ownership in those companies, I think we could see situations where this pandemic actually leads to a shift in industrial policy that pushes certain industries to, for example, to a more carbon neutral or a lower carbon footprint kind of supply chain.
So you've touched on a very intriguing theme, Alex, because if you as a government have become more powerful by bailing out industries and companies, I guess it depends on the government's political inclination. I guess in the U.S., I can see the Trump administration focusing more on this decoupling from China thematic. In Europe, I can see the governments there, or the EU, focusing on the climate change narrative. In the case of Japan, maybe a little more old school, make the shareholders in Japan wealthier by bringing some of the capital back. But one thing that I guess is a common thread along all of this is automation, Alex. And even in the near term, I think there's some of the disruption that we will probably see is greater capabilities in manufacturing processes where you don't need to rely on cheap labor as much.
Oh, absolutely. So if industry is going to move to localization, if the objective is to get strategic industries to produce as close to the local market as possible, if there isn't a labor pool that can facilitate that, or if there isn't the right kind of supplier ecosystem, how do you get around something like that? Well, you get around that by figuring out how to automate entire processes, and how to build an assembly plant or some kind of manufacturing operation from start to finish that basically incorporates robots, and we see that happening already today. Let's go back to the Japanese example. Canon has been reshoring its camera factories from China and around Southeast Asia back to Japan. And they're doing this by basically opening up fully automated end-to-end factories. So obviously there are benefits, certainly in a pandemic situation where you don't have to worry about humans, not being able to come to work. If machines can get most of that work done, then that will happen. I think we'll see more and more automation within entire supply chains. They've been talking about fully automated cargo vessels. I'm not sure I'm ready to get on a fully automated aircraft.
Neither am I.
But if you think about it, you could start with the ground operations, right? Do you need people to load bags onto aircraft? Do you need people in warehouses to sort merchandise and to pack and to ship? Well, less and less. So automation, I think, will absolutely get a really strong kickstart from this whole pandemic.
It's interesting. I was reading this essay by John Cochran, who used to teach at University of Chicago, and now he's with Hoover Institution. And he also argued that the legacy of COVID-19 would be a lot of low-skilled jobs. So people who enforce social distancing and take temperatures of people in front of buildings, things that you see right now on an emergency basis, but might become a part of our regular fabric going forward. But that sort of is a sad state of the world, because those are obviously going to be very low-paying jobs. The hope has always been that somehow or the other you're going to restore the blue-collar jobs that used to pay decent salary in manufacturing plants to come back. But the portrayal that you are sharing with us suggests that that may not be the case.
Yeah, I think those jobs are never coming back, unless there is some kind of a policy push to essentially make sure that people stay gainfully employed, in certain sectors and certain niches. But whether or not they would actually be needed, in a world where more and more machines can do the work that people used to do, I think is probably would be debatable, in most cases. But you've just brought up another point, which is, let's keep this in the context of supply chains, and that is, jobs in the middle class and the types of jobs that are created in a new fully automated world. There will be many more jobs created, but they will be in the knowledge economy. They will be in the technology sphere. They will be in the programming and of computers and algorithms and things of that nature. So this whole shift to automation within supply chains, I think, is a microcosm of a much bigger phenomenon, which is that we're going to continue to see a hollowing out of the middle class, right? Of the people who had those traditional manufacturing jobs, and the new types of jobs that are coming out are essentially really good jobs at the top, really good high-paying jobs in the knowledge economy, stuff like what you and I are doing. And then the other jobs are really not very well paid and not very, very good jobs at the bottom end, which is not a good scenario to be in.
No, not at all. But however, this brings me to the issue of services. So far, we've talked about stuff, goods, supply chain. There's also a supply chain, so to speak, with services, right?
Yes.
Share with us a little bit about that.
Well, I knew you were going to leave me to say the word, so I'll try and say it in one go. But what we're calling the servicification of supply chains. It's taken me a few practice runs, but yes. So when we look at supply chains today, when we look more specifically at global value chains, we tend to think of the physical movement of goods, the materials to the fabrication sites, and then from there to the distribution center, and then from there to the customers, et cetera. But to make all of that happen, you need a lot of different kinds of service activities, right? I mean, you need, and many of these are completely overlooked, right? When you look at the landed cost of a product, you don't tend to think of these things, but you've got everything in there from a service perspective, from customs brokers to accountants and professional services firms. Increasingly now you have, if it's an e-commerce platform that you've bought something from, You've got, all of the people behind those services. Then, of course, you have the actual traditional services in the warehouse operators, and so on and so forth. So, if you look at a world that's more fully automated in terms of a supply chain, if you look at the way people are buying products, you're seeing a world that is going to create new jobs and new opportunities around, for example, traceability. So the need to be able to trace not just a consumer product, but all the parts and components that go into a finished electronic good, for example, to be able to know where every single one of those parts and components came from, where they've been, what their values are. These kinds of things are becoming more and more important for companies as we look at this new techno-nationalist environment, for example, where we have export controls. You can sell to this party, but you can't sell to that. You can buy from this party, but you can't sell from that. Well, how do you know? How do you know what went into your product, into your finished good? So, or what about carbon footprints, right? What's the carbon footprint of your finished good? Well, what was the carbon footprint of this stage at subcontractor number 3? Or even beyond that, what kind of labor standards, were in play at subcontractor number 5, right? All of this stuff is going to call for an advancement in the technology and in the management process of tracing your full supply chain, right? So that's what we call servicification. So then you've got the data that produces. You've got the analysis that comes out of that. So, essentially you've got the whole digital economy going to work in these traceable supply chains. So I would expect to see much more of that.
Right. So what does that mean for countries like India and perhaps even to some extent Philippines, which have benefited tremendously from outsourcing of call centers and transcription services? How will those things get disrupted? I mean, should they basically also build in India and sell in India sort of model, or there's still some hope for some of those jobs to stay in developing world?
Yeah, I think those are not going to disappear overnight, but certainly the emerging world is absolutely going to feel the brunt of the automation revolution. There's no question about it. So, if we go back to India 15 years from now, I think we will see a number of the jobs in call service centers, as you've mentioned, may very well be gone, but they might be replaced with more, local and regionally specific type businesses and operations. And interestingly enough, I mean, I know again we're talking about supply chains today, but if we look at some of the other engines of growth that we could be seeing in the emerging markets, driven by technology, is the sharing economy, for example, right? The rise of the informal economy, and that I think also plays into a more localized economy, a localized supply chain.
So, Alex, before going to the bigger picture, longer term issues, I just want to ask you one sort of, ask you to prognosticate a little bit. I mean, where do you see global supply chains in terms of capacity 6 months from now, taking into cognizance the 30% decline in demand that WTO is forecasting?
Yeah, it's a tough one, but I think it depends on how well countries are able to manage the coronavirus. Obviously it's going to come down to, how soon the workforce comes back, how that's phased in, if you will, if we're able to avoid, a second or third major wave of infections. So really, I mean, just as the global economy as a whole is linked to how well governments are able to manage the pandemic, supply chains are in that same bucket. They clearly will fare just as the economies fare.
Right. I'll just share with you my personal view, and I don't think we're too separate in that, which is that manufacturing is such a strong part of the fabric of developed nations, industrial nations, that to get the young workers who are somewhat, relatively speaking, low at risk of COVID-19 infection or debilitating infection, they try to bring them online as quickly as possible, whereas things like travel and recreation, which require close commingling of not formal workforce, but visitors and consumers, that might be far more challenging. So I sort of think along those lines.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And of course, this all comes down to testing too, right? How quickly can we get adequate testing out so we know who's already had it and who can go back to work, right? Who might have an immunity to it, who needs to be sheltered and protected, and so forth. And so obviously, we've been hearing this now for days and weeks, but it is absolutely critical, to get as many people back to work as possible. You have to figure out who's healthy and who is susceptible.
Absolutely. So, Alex, the longer term picture and some of the stuff we've already touched upon, the issue of industrial policy perhaps taking a more central role in companies' decision to stay in one country or the other. And we have also touched on the role of China. Perhaps a broader picture may be that the supply chain does not only exist in China, it exists all over the world, including the US and Europe. Paint us a picture between automation, politics, trade war, COVID-19 reality. Where are we heading toward?
Yeah, so I would say that geopolitics will continue to really drive what happens in the commercial world. So the primacy of geopolitics now, more than any time in the last 20 or even 30 years plus, will continue to be a major factor in how value chains evolve. So the U.S.-China technology rivalry, what I call techno-nationalism, I think is going to absolutely fundamentally change how the tech sector looks in terms of partnerships, in terms of production, in terms of research and development. These things are going to be decoupled, and semiconductors, for example, would be an industry that I think is going to come under a lot of strain, in the context of geopolitics. So geopolitics will continue to play a major role. I do think that when we talk about the United States and China, what we're really talking about is China and the West. So as the West essentially begins to build policy, and I do think there's going to be, I don't like to use the word industrial policy, but I do think in the tech sector we're going to see new forms of alliances, new forms of public-private partnerships, new kind of consortiums of companies forming in reaction to these geopolitical these geopolitical tensions, if you will, between China, U.S., China, and the West. And a lot of these will be ideologically driven. So, there will be constraints on doing business with companies, for example, that perhaps are engaging in what would be considered a human rights violation, whether it's the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province, and there are now restrictions placed on selling and doing business with surveillance technology companies, for example, or even drone companies, et cetera. So these types of things are so ideology. When people talk about a possible Cold War between the U.S. and China, I don't like that term. I would call it sort of a hybrid Cold War or a hybrid technology Cold War. But people generally say that when you look at China and the U.S. and the West, you cannot compare it to the old Cold War, which was purely mostly ideological, right? It was. Right. You can't make that same comparison today. So the argument goes with China and the West, because China isn't trying to convert the rest of the world to its form of communism, et cetera. But in fact, there are clear ideological differences that I think are going to manifest themselves in business fragmentation and value chain fragmentation. I just mentioned a couple of them. So those I think are going to become more prominent as time goes on. So geopolitics is one area. We've talked about the other area, and that is that technology is and has been impacting value chains, and it has been driving those value chains to localize. Because at the end of the day, if you can produce something as close as possible to your market, what's the point of having an international supply chain that spans 3 continents? There is no point, right? The whole idea of doing that is because you're rationalizing and you happen to have unbundled your supply chain to take advantage of unique benefits and opportunities throughout those different locations. But if you've got everything locally, if you're able to produce exactly what you want and make money doing it, then there's no point in having such an extended supply chain. So technology has been pushing that and has been pushing that envelope. I think the other is climate change. As climate change becomes more and more of an urgent issue, as we start seeing the negative effects of climate change, reduction in carbon emissions is going to mean shorter supply chains. It's going to mean producing different kinds of things, but also, again, producing them closer to home. Even agriculture. Take for example, a supply chain that would be associated with putting a pound of beef on a plate in a restaurant. If you go back through that supply chain and you look at how destructive it is environmentally, from first clearing trees for grazing land, and then of course the water usage, the soil erosion, the carbon footprint for moving that beef, wherever it needs to go in the world. That is a highly inefficient, highly destructive supply chain. Well, if technology allows us in the future to produce protein in a laboratory that can be substituted for beef or lamb or chicken or whatever, and of course companies are working on that now. There's a lot of investment going into that. Well, then we can eliminate those kinds of very destructive supply chains. And again, if we're talking about things like climate change, there's a lot of money that's chasing after those solutions now, as you know, and there will be more of that. So I think geopolitics, technology, climate change definitely are going to have a big role to play on value chains in the future.
Very, very nicely stated, Alex. But then the question is, just like lots of money and resources are being devoted to climate change and coming up with products that are more local or have lower carbon footprint, there is a lot of vested interest. There's a reason why large corporations wanted to move production overseas, because that fattened their margins, even after taking into account the cost of moving things back and forth. Will that pushback slow things down? Or you think we are at a point of no return and the reabsorption of the supply chain closer to home is inevitable and actually is going to accelerate going forward?
No, that's a great question, and of course that's a classic question for a political economist, right? Because you have two things happening here. One, you have the market, and you have the market forces, which of course, for big companies that have huge sunken costs, of course they're not going to be motivated to strand those costs and to start moving on to other things, that aren't going to produce, at least initially, a profit or a benefit. So in that regard, I think there's going to be, and we will see more and more of this, we will see more pressure from states, and even depending on which part of the world we're talking about, there will be pressure from consumers, there will be pressure from NGOs, and that process will slowly work its way through to where you have financial institutions that are looking to invest in, and we're seeing that, of course, already. They're looking to invest in greener, more, environmentally sound projects and so forth and so on. And then at the same time, we would probably see and will see governments sort of pushing sort of through public-private partnerships, different initiatives to sort of steer the economy in that direction. The other conundrum here, Taimur, is you have a lot of people that are employed in these industries, right? I mean, I could go back to the ranching industry or the livestock industry, and if you were to essentially, if we would fast forward 40 years from now, and we've got, for example, vegetable protein, but as I mentioned, we also have, and we would need to see significant advances from where we are today. But let's assume that we get to a point where lab-grown protein that can be essentially, substituted, or that perfectly replicates any kind of meat that is out there today. Let's say we're able to produce that at scale in the future. Well, if that happens, then you're going to have a complete elimination of a lot of those jobs along the entire supply chain, right? And livelihoods. So again, how do we deal with people like that need gainful employment? That's going to be that is one of the challenges of this whole technology automation revolution.
Right. So two questions. So you started by talking about how geopolitics is a major dominating theme going forward in terms of this reabsorption of the supply chain. Is it just a US versus China thing, or you think that geopolitical pushback against China's concentration of supply chain has expanded to Europe and North Asia?
Well, let's take Europe first. When it comes to European interests regarding, for example, the setting of standards in things like 5G, for example, which China is dominating right now, Europe is very much aligned with the United States in coming up with sort of a counterbalance to having a world where, for example, standards in 5G, maybe standards in other kinds of sectors, are going to be representative of Western interests. In other words, they're going to provide a level playing field for European companies, and in the case of the United States, for American companies, and so forth. So I would absolutely see Europe and the U.S. aligning for standards around supply chain traceability, standards around many different things. So I do think, to answer the question, I do think that it's broader than just a U.S.-China issue. I talked about the ideologies or the values that are inherent to Western culture. When we talk about things like freedom of speech, when we talk about censorship, obviously privacy, privacy issues are going to be huge. So those are all standards that are uniquely Western, not just American. And as I said earlier, I do think that those standards will continue to be baked into not just free trade agreements, which we are seeing with the CPTPP and certainly any European free trade agreement, but I think there will be baked into, as I mentioned earlier, the standards that apply to different industries, and therefore the standards that will apply to the companies that are working in those industries, and who they can work with and who they cannot work with.
Of course, all of this can force China to raise their standards and IP protection and take the excuse away from the Europeans or the Americans, unless they really want to keep China down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that topic is a topic that really should be explored. We should spend another hour just talking about that one.
Another day, of course.
Yeah, we should definitely do that. I mean, just not to get too far off track, but if you look at, for example, going back to 5G, and you look at some of the ideas that are out there to open source, basically, all of the underlying foundational technology that goes into 5G, from end to end, would that somehow, open things up for a globalized standard, right? That would allow all kinds of companies to come in. Is that the way forward? I think there are arguments to be made, for and against that in terms of whether we'll ever get there. But at this point, I think we're at the initial stages of essentially a fractured or a fracturing landscape, commercial landscape along the lines that we've just discussed. Whether or not the relationship will either get better or worse, I mean, that remains to be seen. I mean, certainly COVID-19 has really laid bare, I think, some of the systemic differences that we're seeing now between China and the rest of the world.
No, it's going to be a bumpy ride, no doubt. Alexander Capri, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
It's been great. You've been listening to Kopi Time. You can find all our research publications in multimedia by Googling DBS Research Library. Thanks for joining us.